my short presentation tries to contextualize the present pandemic and its management into a historical perspective. And I shall proceed in 3 short chapters, from infectious diseases, progress and problems, to the European response and the contemporary framing of a pandemic. So I start with a look at infectious diseases, progress and problems. And as a scientist, I need not explain to you what is meant scientifically with the word infectious diseases. It is a matter of microbiology, of virus, bacteria, vaccination, research, Nobel Prizes. It is, in all, a history of progress and success. But you see, there is a lot of space on this slide, and I should like to fill it. But before I show you an optimistic view, it is already from the year 1943. 1943, wrote Charles Edward Winslow the book, The Conquest of Epidemic Disease. And he was optimistic because conquest means victory. In German, one would say der Sieg über. So this is very optimistic, but as there is a lot of space on the right side, I should like to fill it. And I fill it with problems. History is always dealing with problems. So if we regard infectious diseases, we have to see them not in a laboratory, but in the context of society, or not only in a laboratory, but also in the context of society, culture, and politics. And we have to differentiate between epi and endemics. And what do mass mortality and loss of control lead to? What about attempts to control issued by the executive? Isolation, quarantine, do they work? How do they work? And which side effects are to be seen? Complementary to vaccination on the left side, we have the question of resistance to vaccination, even compulsory vaccination backed by law. Therapies, traditionally in historic and present pandemics, were and are not available at first hand. What does it mean for the image and self-image of medicine? And finally, the framing is important, the perception of the disease in a certain time, culture, and space. And this is, so to say, the history of problems, and it is here artificially separated from the history of progress, but in reality, it is interconnected anytime, as we see it today. So now we proceed to a very short chronology of pandemics. And it's a very short chronology because it is enough to say that it reaches from antiquity to the present. We have in any epoch, from biblical times to the present, pandemics. This is the normal state of mankind. And now, if we turn to infectious diseases as seen in pre-modern times, and I have it here on this slide in a skim. Also in pre-modern times, infectious diseases were conceptualized. It was not science, but it was a naturalistic explanation. And this naturalistic explanation from antiquity in this case was called the concept of miasma. It was the notion of a certain stuff in the air, smelling stuff, but it could not be seen, but it was held to be responsible for the plague, for plague in a general sense of an infectious disease. And this was the naturalistic explanation of learned scholars in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, and in the early modern times. And there was another thing, this was experience. Contagion was always known from antiquity, and it was known by the layman who attended the sick. It was not highly esteemed by pre-modern physicians, but once again, experience was important. and contagion was linked with responsibility and blame. The third is religion. Religion was too important in coping with epidemics. And finally, the rumor of poisoning of wells, in German Brunnenvergiftung, or pestis manufacta in Latin, periodically was a concomitant phenomenon with a lot of epidemics, and always mostly with disastrous consequences. So this is the pre-modern concept of causes in Gänsefüßchen, so to say. So now what is the European response to this challenge? Because the Black Death came in pre-modern times, at the end of the Middle Ages. And the European response, as I call it, it was a lot of, it was a real response. And certain regimina pestis, so these were written regulars for dealing with the plague, anti-plague regulation in the 15th and 16th century beginning. And they comprised a lot of measures. And these are the precursors and models of the Reichsseuchengesetz and also of the present Infektionsschutzgesetz. And this arsenal of measures, it is listed here, was especially used in towns from the Italian seaports of beginning there. So these comparatively simple measures were enforced by the executive, and they are, as we know, they are effective. Fighting plague in Europe since early modern times is primarily politics and police. Rational proto-hygienic measures are combined here with ideological ones. So you see bans on dancing, drinking, that could be explained rationally, but also on cursing and gambling. So this is the positive, the optimistic side of the European answer. But there's also a dark side. And this can be seen here. Pogrom, witch hunt, and religious war are also concomitant phenomena of epidemics. So this has to be kept in mind. And if we look at a very short look at some traces of plague in culture and literature, I've chosen the example of Alessandro Manzoni, I Promessi Sposi, a famous novel from the beginning of the 19th century, but it is dealing with the past of the 17th century. And Manzoni, this is the Goethe of Italy. He wrote it based on archival material. And in this novel, we find a description, a very vivid description of the plague of Milan in 1630, and it is a picture of disaster and violence, a picture of lynching and judicial murder. And these motives are also present in many pieces of modern culture too. For example, in cinema, in films, and in literature. So now we proceed to contemporary framing of a pandemic. And it seems as if I would stick to the time. I wonder myself. I apologize. So what about this? Contemporary framing of a pandemic. Unsurprisingly, medicine, especially virology, and the state, the government, the executive, dominate the discourse. Who else, one would ask? Who else? Medical data and epidemiological numbers are important. But there's a lot of additional space also on this slide, and it waits to be filled. And so I try to do so. Be careful. And now we face not epidemiology, but emotional epidemiology, as it is called in medical history and sociology. It means a combination of rational and moral arguments. And we see here the former Chancellor Merkel. She's warning against evil, cited by the famous Bild-Zeitung. And I'm sure that she said it and with these words. Evil means Unheil. And this is a metaphysical notion, not a rational, not a scientific argument. Another important politician, obviously having read his Max Weber Politik als Beruf of 1919, he tried to build a charismatic leadership during the crisis, not with very good success, one has to admit. Emotional epidemiology means that rational and moral arguments intermingle. And here, some examples, you see it on the list from the public discourse. Solidarity against thoughtlessness. We hear that we are at war in other countries. In Germany, we are in fight against a virus, it is said. And fighting a virus is as realistic as fighting against the air. The notion of enemy shifts from the invisible virus to those people who are infected or suspicious to be infected. And the biological criterion, for example, to be infected or to be not infected, to be vaccinated or not, a biological criterion leads to classification, including moral judgments. This is emotional epidemiology. Charity and philanthropy are certainly to be found in the pandemic's crisis now, but also German Angst, I cannot translate this word, denunciation, rumors of conjuration and violence. Thus, the present framing resembles the early modern framing of plague. Political power tries to prevail against scientific reasoning. For example, the critique of the STIKO, Ständige Impfkommission, it was called by a certain politician a lay committee of honorary people. And this political attack was rejected by a brave scientist, Rüdiger van Kries, and he is a brave scientist because he is working in Munich in Bavaria, so it's very brave. Another example, in public discourse, epidemiological problems are discussed as matters of crime and punishment, Schuld und Sühne. Unschuldige Kranke, maybe oncological patients, are contrasted to the guilty ones. And this is early modern pattern of thinking. A final example, some high-ranking politicians don't control their language. Here's the example of Winfried Kretschmann, who called protesters Aasgeier der Pandemie. In English, one would say vultures of the pandemic. This is a problematic metaphor, especially in Germany. And this only a few examples of a lot. And I come to the conclusion. This is the final slide. Plague is a concomitant phenomenon in all epochs and times. Europe has, beginning after the disaster of the Black Death, formulated a confident response, rules and regulations meant to contain the epidemic. This way has been successful until the present, but it is linked with strong political power and a state of emergency. Anyone observing the present has to keep in mind the historical origin and the development of anti-plague measures. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Leven, for this interesting presentation. Are there any questions? Immediate questions? My question would then be, from a historical perspective, is it quite normal for pandemics that there is a social uprise. You already mentioned the pogrom, the witch hunt, and so on. But we have a certain fraction of people who turn really against our government, or sometimes even against our democracy. Is this normal for pandemics?
Generally spoken, I say that during pandemics or epidemics, that would be the better word for it, epidemics, it is a rather normal uprise. We have it in the early modern period in some countries, in Germany, in England, in France. So it is rather normal that social uprise is following the epidemic crisis.
So there's a question from Christine Falk. You want to state it yourself, or should I read it?
I have to.
Yes, thank you very much. I was very interested in your presentation because it shows the tight interaction between the society and the pandemic. And you also mentioned German angst. So the question I have for you is the term prevention. Did that ever come up in the context of a pandemic? Because angst is not probably the thing that people are arguing. They should also talk about prevention. But this could be in the context of other diseases. Cancer would be one of the key diseases where you would say prevention is key, like the Decade Against Cancer in Germany has a lot of issues on prevention. So is there any link between prevention and the pandemic in history? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I would generally say that the origin of a healthcare system in Europe is the result of the confrontation with the Black Death and the following epidemic. So the notion of prevention, to prevent the disease by measures, for example, barriers and sanitaire, cordon sanitaire, the notion of prevention is exactly the result of this European response against the pandemic threat. Okay, that's true.
Okay, the next question is from Christian Bogdan. Sorry, I overlooked it in the first place.
No problem. Karl-Heinz, if one listens to your talk, one could get the impression that the state nowadays, here in Germany, also in other European countries, doesn't really act any different from what we have seen actually in the Middle Ages. So I'm wondering whether you also would have a little bit more optimistic view available for us in terms of what else could be done, because the list of regulations and measurements is more or less identical to what has been done during the plague time.
Oh, Christian, I beg your pardon that I did not speak more optimistic, but we know each other well. So in the core, I have to be an optimistic. That's my second Christian name. But to be honest, so there is. I did not. I only alluded to it. The European response to pandemics means that we have an accumulation of scientific measures now, and it is. Jetzt fehlen mir die Worte. It is a Lernkurve. It is an upgrading process of learning more and doing more. And medicine, scientific medicine, since the end of the 19th century, plays a very important role, as you all know, because you are engaged in it. So this is the optimistic part of the story. So we have an growth of medical properties and measures and means, including vaccination naturally and other means. This is the positive, the progress. But the dark side, we have it too. We can't ignore it. This is the essence of my talk. We can't ignore the dark side.
Yeah. Thanks.
And Andreas Radbruch has the final question, please.
I was just wondering, since when science is used to authorize measurements? Probably in the old ages, it was more kinds of God-given authority or religion or something like that. That was no reasoning actually required, except based on experience. But since when do we have actually science involved?
Well, I fear that I did not acoustically understand your question. I beg your pardon. Could you say it in German so I can understand it?
Ja, seit wann spielt Wissenschaft in der Autorisierung der Maßnahmen eine Rolle, vor allem so eine große Rolle? Denn bis vor kurzem war es ja wahrscheinlich sozusagen absolutistisch oder religiös ausreichend, die Maßnahmen zu begründen.
Not at all, Herr Radbruch. Also in the late Middle Ages, in the 14th century, the measures were based on medical experience or medical concepts. So the proto-hygienic measures in Venice and other countries and other ports in Italy, they were based on contemporary medical reasoning. So it is not it's not right to say they were all religious and kind of stupid, and no, they were as prudent as we are, but they did not have natural scientific medicine naturally, but they had concepts, naturalistic concepts, not only religion.